Welcome to today's George BlueSpruce Hero Healer Luncheon series. Its purpose is to refresh and inspire. It's usually a luncheon, but not during COVID, so I wish I were there eating lunch with you guys, and I look forward to the times we can do that again. You will be muted, but Dr. Padilla is glad to take questions. The way to get those in would be to chat, and Alita will be able to catch that chat and ask the question of Dr. Padilla. ATSU is the premier the premier educator of healers and leaders for the underserved, and it's their national safety net of community health centers. George BlueSpruce is of Pueblo American Indian heritage. He overcame many obstacles and stereotypes to become the nation's first American Indian dentist. He worked with the American Indian communities through the Indian Health Service, eventually rising to the position of Assistant Surgeon General. After retiring, he dedicated his life to daring American Indian children to dream and mentoring them into the health professions. And he's the reason that ATSU has educated half of the American Indian dental students in the country in the last 20 years. Therefore, we named this luncheon series after him. Today's hero healer is my friend Luis Padilla. Dr. Padilla is a community health center physician and leader who presently oversees health workforce for the Public Health Service. In that role, he also serves as director of the National Service Corps and its field strength of 16,000 clinicians. He is committed to preparing healers for underserved communities and for their national network of 14,000 community health center clinics. He's also an ally of ATSU, and ATSU is an ally of his organization in our joint efforts to address the needs of underserved communities. Let us learn and be refreshed from some stories and gain inspiration. Perhaps we can find other ways that we can make a difference. Welcome, Dr. Padilla.
Thank you, Gary, and thank you so much for the privilege and honor of presenting to this group today. When was it, Gary, that I was out in Arizona? Was that in 2018?
I do. I think it was 2 years ago, roughly. Yeah.
Was it 2 years ago? About 2018. And what I remember from that day, Gary, is me showing up in a suit and tie, you picking me up, and you say, you know, it's 115 degrees today. And I was sweating. And he goes, but it's dry heat. And my comment to Gary was, heat is heat, dry or wet, whatever. This is really hot in Arizona at that time. What helped me overcome that sweating feeling was just the warm reception that I got there, Gary, from you, the staff, and the students that I presented at that time. And it really helped me. And it gave me an uplifting feeling afterwards. And on my flight back, I was just reflecting on that presentation and all those faces there. And probably many of whom have already graduated from their program, putting out more clinicians to meet the needs of rural and underserved communities. So I want to thank you for inviting me back. It must have gone okay for you to invite me back again. So it's just a privilege to speak with you and have this conversation today. So thank you very much. And then for everyone who's listening in, I just want to thank all of you, whatever role you're playing right now, whether it's in faculty or as a student, your dedication and service, and ultimately what you're going to accomplish in your career. So I want to thank you in advance for your service. So thank you. I'll advance the slides here since I'm showing my screens. But I wanted to share with you first I know that Gary wants me to focus in on sort of my story, and I certainly will do that. But I think it's important to put my journey, my story, in the context of what we see as the clinician life cycle at HRSA, specifically at BHW. Here, there's a picture of me. This is the oldest picture of me. There are no pictures of me younger than this. We didn't have cameras in Guatemala. My parents couldn't afford that. This picture was actually taken when my mother and father were here in the United States. They left me with some relatives as they ventured to this country to make a life for themselves, and eventually called for us about 4 years later. So I was separated from my parents for about 4 years before we were reunited in Marlborough, Massachusetts, when I found out I had another addition to the family. My brother was born during that time. So it was a big family reunion at that time. But I start with this picture because each one of you has a life cycle. And if we put it in the context of workforce, you have a clinician life cycle. And it begins as early as this. It begins in those early formative years, that education that you receive at home, the formal education that you're going to receive, and then you're going to transition into what we call training. And you making choices, and you've already made choices about the health profession program that you're going to be a part of. And you're going to make other choices before you ultimately get to the point where we would like to see more and more clinicians go, and that is in that area of service. Recognizing that there are vulnerable communities across the country, and each of us in our own way can make a difference. But one of the things I want to highlight today during my talk is the intentionality of that path, of that life cycle. We can certainly go through these steps and graduate from your health profession school, maybe go on to residency. But unless you apply some intentionality, you might not be in the place that maybe your heart called you into service initially. So I just want to highlight that for you. We certainly see this life cycle occurring, and the story that I'm going to share, which is my story, is only unique, and it's my story. This is replicated countless of times in our health professions ecosystem, if you will. So this is just my unique story and my background that sort of led to me being where I am right now. So it did start in Guatemala. I am the child of Guatemalan immigrants who left Guatemala to do what every immigrant family wants to do, find a better place for their family. But not just, in Spanish we say, not para vivir, but sobrevivir. Not just to survive, but to thrive. And it was my parents' desire to find a home where we could thrive. We knew we were survivors, they were survivors, but they wanted an opportunity to thrive in the environment. And more importantly, my parents really, and I'm sure like many of your parents in upbringing, really stressed the importance of service, really stressed the importance of giving to others and making sure that whatever you accomplish in life, there was a part of it that could be shared with others to help others come along. So when we look at the path of many of our health professions, mine is no different. This talk of social determinants of health, you hear about this all the time. The environment in which you live, the background that you bring to bear has an impact on your health, where you work, where you eat, where you play. And we see corollaries in education. So the social determinants of education are really strong and are determining factors in your decisions of where you go and your ability to really succeed. My factors, economic instability, immigration, English as a second language, my parents who did not have a significant formal education. I'm the first in my family to attend college. It's certainly the first to go to medical school. All these things are my social determinants of education. And I think that along my journey, I've had a number of individuals who have helped me along that path and helped me overcome some of these obstacles. But I don't want to signal to you that these obstacles that I have had have in some way not positively influenced my perspective. They have. And it's not I succeeded because or despite of, it's actually I succeeded because of that background as well. Because of what my parents provided me, the support, the dedication, and ultimately the demonstration of perseverance, which I think all of you have demonstrated up to this point in your careers, is so important in getting where you want to be and helping others achieve their goals as well. So for us, and I want to bring this back to our work, for us, we really focus on these social determinants of education, recognizing that many of the students that we want to support have backgrounds, have contexts in their lives, and there may be some impediments to them being successful. I think all of you have heard that about 30% of college students drop out after the first year. And it could be higher among African Americans or Latinos. And there's various factors for that. And what we're striving to do is to assist them at every phase, that education, training, and ultimately the service, to try to get them in a position to be successful and ultimately provide service in rural and underserved areas. So my story is not unique, but I think that it highlights one example of the many struggles that our health profession students face in their aims of reaching their goals. So as I transitioned from high school, undergraduate to medical school, I found myself being, and I showed here the picture of my medical student grad, and there's a little circle there of the bright-eyed, bushy-tailed Luis here, who's so excited about being in his class of about 156 students. I was one of 2 Latinos in the class. So there's another situation that occurs as we move along this path. We sometimes find ourselves looking around and not seeing similar faces or familiar backgrounds. And that certainly is the case in medical school, as my example showed. And we certainly see this as an opportunity to assist medical schools in identifying ways to adjust their admissions criteria. We have supported the inclusion of holistic admission criteria in medical schools and nursing schools to make sure that these health profession schools recognize that they're, again, these social determinants of health, these factors can impact the ability of students from these backgrounds to not matriculate from health profession school. Here, there's a picture of my mother here who's hugging me. She was very happy in the occasion. She, along the way, reminded me that perseverance is important. I was an older student in medical school. Many of my colleagues that you see here were in their 20s. I was in my 30s. Having been around the block a couple of times, having some mishaps, and then coming back around to really dedicate myself to health professions. That wasn't the typical course. And we find that to be the case in many students' situations who have had not traditional backgrounds and paths to their health profession education. So I highlight this because, again, along the way in this life cycle, in this path, there are areas where we hope to touch students. We hope to support, whether it's in medical school, nursing, PA, oral health, to move them to the next phase. And the next phase being, for many of us, certainly in medical school, being our residencies, right? So it doesn't end in medical school. And I saw this as an opportunity to continue what I was interested in, which was service. How can I prepare myself for what I eventually will be doing for most of, if not all of my career, and that is providing service to rural and underserved communities. And there are many paths that medical residents can choose from, but I chose to only apply to those programs that were embedded in federally qualified health centers. And I was fortunate to get admitted into Brown's program, which had an FQHC, outpatient FQHC, that I trained at. And that was important for me to understand how education and service to a community can be combined, and the challenges that comes with it, but also the opportunities. And the reason I highlight this is, again, you're going to be, depending on the path that you're choosing, going to be making decisions about any postgraduate training. And I do encourage you to think about training in these communities to get really good perspective about how they deliver care, the challenges, and maybe provide you opportunities to modify your education at that point in time. So after I was done with my residency program, I started my service at Unity Healthcare. I don't know if you can see back here. I think probably Gary will know who this is. I don't know if I can zoom in here. But this is a portrait that was commissioned by the late Fitzhugh Mullen. And in this portrait is his dad with a child sitting on his lap. And the reason Fitz wanted us to commission a local artist to do this is to highlight his family's connection to service and dedication to communities. And we were delighted that we did this. And this portrait, this mural still is prominently hung at Unity Upper Cardozo. And I highlight this because of the picture that we have here. This was a team of providers that I worked with to combat obesity in our community. And this was a number of children who were participating in our after clinic hours and doing some activities within the clinic. Working at an FQHC after my training was an invaluable experience, because up until that point, it was all book learning, experiential learning, And it wasn't really until I got to uni where I got to apply a lot of what I learned and also modify a lot of what I learned. The individuals that I trained with, that I worked with at Unity were exceptional, committed, mission-minded individuals who are still there today. Many of whom that I worked with who have been working there for decades, providing services to the community. So this is the end of the road, if you will, that we'd like to see more of our students that we support take, that is service to these communities, ideally at organizations like FQHC, IHS sites, those that really have dedicated intentional missions of caring for these communities and making sure that the social determinants of health get addressed, as well as their medical and mental health and oral health conditions. So I want to bring this full circle, and we'll have plenty of time for questions, but as we look at my journey, as you look at my journey as I've laid it out, I hope you see that it was intentional, but it also followed a path. I was obviously educated as an undergrad, my residency program, and ultimately service. And I took that as I went on to HRSA after 12 years at Unity, because I saw an organization that was like-minded, a mission that was similar to my professional personal mission, one that really was an extension of the work that I was already doing at Unity, but it allowed me the opportunity to make an impact, however small, on a larger scale, on a national scale, and help to influence the direction of many of HRSA's workforce programs, and really focusing again on this continuum. How do we support health profession students from early years of education, as early as we can, all the way through this life cycle to service, and then going back again and offering opportunities for the students and clinicians that we support to come back and give back, if you will, and help train the next generation of health providers in these communities. So as we look at this continuum, what we're focused on, and again, this is really an extension of the ideals that I learned in school and I practiced at Unity. How do we increase access to culturally competent care? How do we achieve an equilibrium of supply and demand for our healthcare providers across the country? How do we better distribute? I think all of you who are reading the news probably more than we should nowadays are aware of the maldistribution of many of our health professions, particularly nursing, where we went into this pandemic with not so much a undersupply as a significant, really disturbing maldistribution of that workforce. And now the pandemic has really hit the nursing workforce hard, more than any other discipline in the health professions. They have really been on the front lines and they've taken a hit. And that maldistribution that we went into this pandemic with has gotten worse as a result of it. And lastly, how do we augment the quality of the workforce and the care that they provide, and ultimately demonstrate through our efforts that these communities are healthier, they're better off, they're not just surviving, they're thriving. And we hope to make inroads in that direction. So it's not just about the quality of education and training, but ultimately about the quality of care that our community members and populations that we strive to serve receive and benefit from. So I hope that gives you a little bit of insight into my journey, my motivations, how that journey has influenced my professional decisions and how I've applied, because I don't operate in a vacuum. I don't think anybody does. And my background, my perceptions have certainly influenced and continue to influence the work that we undertake at the agency and the Bureau specifically. So let me stop there, Gary, and I'll give it back to you if you'd like, and we can have some questions.
Alita, do you have the questions to?
I do have a question. So I have a question here from Brent. Dr. Padilla, he would like to know your thoughts on the needs in Arizona specifically. He's a native to Arizona and will be training in Flagstaff, Northern Arizona for his rotations. And he's considering where he can make the biggest impact.
The needs in Arizona are very similar, particularly when you look at the rural and frontier areas of Arizona are very similar to the others that many states face, whether it's North Dakota, South Dakota, Wyoming, Missouri. What we're identifying, and I think others within the agency have also identified, these rural and frontier communities are struggling with needs that is very different and stark than their urban counterparts. And I think that what the last few years have shown us is we haven't done enough to address some of those rural factors that are really impeding our ability to provide quality services to these communities that will help them improve their health and well-being. I think you've all seen the reports that the CDC has put out. Those community members who live in rural areas, they don't live as long, they're not as healthier, and even those conditions like hypertension, cancer, they're often disproportionately higher in rural and frontier communities. So if you were to ask me, since you have asked me, I would take a look at those communities and see where you might be able to offer your really critical services in those areas. There's not a particular area because I think the needs are vast, but I think really determining whether you're a fit for those rural or frontier areas, and if you are, dedicating yourself to service in those areas, that's probably the best thing that you can do for Arizona. Stay in Arizona.
Okay, I have another question here from Monica. What advice do you have for balancing a desire to serve others through health with the inevitable burnout that accompanies a lifetime of service for the underserved?
Well, if I could be so bold as to say first, I'm not convinced it's inevitable. I would like to just sort of offer a little, the glass is half full kind of approach, and that is the risk of you needing resiliency and perhaps burning out is high in the health profession, and it's high in primary care, but I don't believe it's inevitable. I believe that finding institutions that support you. So let's first talk about the fact that this isn't an individual thing. It's not that individuals aren't strong enough or resilient enough to withstand what primary care, what modern day medicine has that is challenging. It really is incumbent upon the organizations that you're ultimately going to work for to support you in that effort. And I think ATSU is doing that already and supporting their students. I know that firsthand because we fund them to do some of that work. So I know that they do that already. And there are many organizations that really have a dedicated, committed view towards supporting their workforce. So first I'd say I don't think it's inevitable, but how do you reduce that risk? You reduce that risk by making sure that you have strong connections, obviously with your family, with peers, those who are like-minded, and hopefully finding organizations that support that mission that you have. I would resist that temptation and ask those critical questions as you're looking for your career opportunities. What do you do to support your providers? What do you do to support your staff? Because if they're not supporting their staff, then it's unlikely that they're going to be able to support you. So ask those tough questions during those interview times when you're looking around for your career placement. What are you doing as an organization to support us through this really hard work? I would say that in my personal view, we have 3 spheres to our existence: our mind, our body, and our spirit. And I think it's incumbent upon us individually to make sure that we're addressing each of those as frequently and often as we can. And certainly you're all going to exercise, you're all going to get healthy food, you're all going to sleep, but are we supporting each other with a healthy network, right? Sometimes I listen in with my colleagues who in primary care who get together to complain about their jobs. And I understand we want to support and vet, but it also can be a little draining to hear that day in and day out. I think you need to find individuals outside of healthcare who will help you fill that cup periodically and rejuvenate you in your commitment and your effort to support these communities. So I would say, in my personal opinion, it's those 3, mind, body, spirit, and whatever does that for you is really what you should pursue.
Okay, I have a question here from Christine Morgan. Can you talk about HRSA programs that support students for commitment to the underserved?
Oh, thanks. Gary wouldn't let me list them all out, so I couldn't list them all out for you, but I blame Gary. No. We have a lot. In terms of education, we support through our Health Careers Opportunities program students as early as seniors in high school. We right now, where you are in Arizona, we have AHEC centers, Area Health Education Centers, that support students in their placements of rotations throughout the state and local area. We have our centers for actually one that might be of particular interest to you is our Scholarship for Disadvantaged Students. So this is a program that we provide funding to academic institutions who in turn provide scholarships for students that come from disadvantaged backgrounds. We recently released that competition, so that's definitely one that you should look at. We support graduate medical education programs. Our Teaching Health Center GME program is a program that's really rooted in the community. It's a community-based program for medical residents, psychiatrists, oral health providers. We support dentists with that, OBGYNs as well. So if you're interested in a community-based residency program, I encourage you to take a look at that THC GME program. And then on the service side, I think you all are familiar with the National Service Corps, our Nurse Corps programs. We continue to work wonders with our budget, the National Service Corps, in trying to fund down that list. This year we had over 8,500 applications for 3,500 awards, loan repayer awards. We were able to fund only about 40%, so it's pretty competitive. But in terms of the service side, that is definitely a program that you should look at.
I have a question here from Dr. Sharon Obadia. For our students considering applying to the NHSC, could you highlight your favorite aspects of this loan repayment program?
Tax-free. That's my favorite part. And that's a recent development. Before, you'd get a loan repayment or a scholarship from the federal government, and then they go turn around and tax you on it. Fortunately, that was changed about 7 years ago, I believe. So now it's tax-free. I like that aspect of it from a financial perspective. The other thing I really enjoy about the program is that it really is supporting clinicians. The loan repayment program is supporting clinicians who are already there. So you've already made a decision to work in primary care or primary health services. You've already made a decision to work in a community-based organization, one that has health profession shortage needs. And we want to try to keep you there. And we know that right now many students have crushing debt coming out of school. The average scholarship award that we give out now for medical students is $285,000 is the average scholarship award. And that's gone up steadily over the last years. It's higher for oral health providers. Some of our awards for dentists are nearing a $500,000 award. So highly competitive scholarships where we pay full tuition and costs. So I like the fact that we're supporting clinicians who have made a decision to be there. And I like when we have more than one clinician who are in those organizations so that they can create that peer network effect, if you will. So those are some of the things I enjoy about the program.
Okay, I have a question here from Arthur. In working with Latinx students of immigrant parents and those brought to the US as children, I have often referred to them as having each foot in a different world, culturally and traditionally. Asking for those students who struggle with expectations from family, the expectations of medical school and the students' dream and goals, did you have moments of internal conflict between those identities and roles? And what advice would you give to those Latinx medical students who also struggle?
It's so funny you asked that, because yesterday I was being interviewed by a contractor who was helping one of our other bureaus on strategic planning. And she said, you know, I looked you up and you have a very interesting story that's very similar to mine. And you should take a look at this book called Limbo and I was just looking because I haven't gotten it, Lugramos, I think, Lugranos or Lugramos. And the book's concept is exactly what you just highlighted, the limbo that many of us feel that we're in, one foot in this culture, another foot in this other culture, and we're throughout our careers feeling like we're in limbo. So when I talk to my mom about my work, her eyes just sort of gloss over because she has no understanding of what I'm talking about. And it's not because she's not intelligent. We're just living in two very different worlds. And I think that it's very important for us to come to grips with that limbo feeling that we have, and maybe even reaching out to others. And certainly you can reach out to me to get more insight into how we deal with that. In some respects throughout my career, I have chosen to sort of ignore that facet, and then I find myself having to face it over and over again, because you get called into a certain culture, whether it's this privileged professional culture or the Latino culture that for me calls me in. And there are many times in my life where I don't feel at place in either one at times. And so I'm certainly going to get this book and read his perception, his perspective on what it's like living in limbo.
Okay, I have a question from Gigi. What is something you would tell your former self in medical school or residency? Along those lines, is there anything in particular you wish you had known or had considered in your early medical education?
Yeah. I had a setback in residency where I chose that residency program because, as I said, it was linked to an FQHC. And halfway through my residency, the director of that federally qualified health center came in and said, I don't think these residents are really helping us in terms of our productivity. And so they made efforts to do away with that component of their education. And I wish I would have, if I can go back, I'd tell myself, think about that program before you sign on, because there are others that maybe wouldn't have landed me in that position halfway. And that's all to say that as you look at, in terms of making your decisions, delve in a little bit deeper, because I certainly would encourage you to seek additional training opportunities as you move along your career, educational career, in these communities, but make sure that they're stable, that there's some leadership buy-in, because it really impacted me negatively to have that disruption about 2 years into my residency, and having to back out of that. I probably would have made a different decision if that were the case. And what was the second part of your question? If I can go back in time and tell myself something.
Is there anything in particular you wish you had known or had considered in your early medical education?
I think I earlier on, I think I should have been more intentional about understanding the financing of American healthcare. I mean, that's sort of wonky to say, but it comes up over and over and over again. And I never really found time up until I got into leadership roles to really delve further into that. The other part is making sure that, and for me, I did this, but if you have opportunities to live in the community that you're going to work in, like I'm talking, I lived 5 blocks from the health center for over 12 years, and I still live less than a mile from the clinic now. I found that to be invaluable. I mean, there's nothing that made me feel better than going to the grocery store and seeing the patients that I cared for that day, or seeing some of my patients who were struggling with addiction sleeping on the street, or having them come in the middle of the night because they wanted me or my wife, who works in FQHC, to see their children because they were sick in the middle of the night. There's something about having that experience in an urban setting that was quite remarkable.
Dr. Padilla, would you compare and contrast a little bit the enjoyment or the fulfillment you gain from being a provider and the fulfillment or the inspiration you need in order to be an administrator? Are you still practicing? I should ask first.
No, I'm not.
Okay.
I haven't practiced.
Yeah, compare those two.
It's tough. It's tough. And it's been a difficult decision for me over the last 6 years. I've been struggling with the workload and my administrative role, and then having to do the clinical. But when I was doing it, when I was at Unity, I was the medical director and seeing patients, half and half. And I would say that if I could do that easier now, I would, because I worry that I'm starting to lose touch with what it means to be a frontline provider. I have all that memory, but there's something about seeing patients that day that helps you get a little bit more clarity and perspective. And also, Gary, I think what it helped me do was rejuvenate right then and there. I understood intimately what the connection was between my administrative role and caring for individuals. And that was always uplifting. Yes, I could see, 20 patients that day, and a couple of them would be really challenging. And I didn't feel that the relationship was going very well or their care was going very well. But for the most part, it was always an uplifting time for me, and it allowed me to balance sort of that disconnect that you sometimes feel in an administrative role, where you lose a little bit of touch. Did that help answer your question?
Yes, it did.
Okay, I have another question here from Brent. What's the primary reason that keeps physicians from practicing in rural areas? What is the main reason that keeps physicians from staying once they do commit for a time?
So that's a great question. It's multifactorial. There's a lot. It ranges from, let me just step back, because I think when we look at the various factors, it depends on where that clinician is personally. Because if they don't have a family, those factors are different versus when they're married or maybe have a family. When they don't have a family, it tends to be very different in terms of the collegial support, right? I mean, you're all being trained as how to apply science. And part of that training is how do you create that peer network? How do you need to talk with your colleague. How are you managing X, Y, and Z, et cetera? And if you don't have that nucleus in a rural frontier area or an underserved area, it can become very isolating. And so the literature clearly shows that that isolation is not a good recipe to keep professionals in communities for very long. Once they're married, that whole dynamic of their partner starts to influence their decisions to stay or not stay. Their partner may not find a suitable employment for their careers and their aspirations and their goals. And then when you start having family, you start having kids, there's a whole other dimension. And now you start talking about, well, are these the schools that I want to send my kids to? Is this the environment in which I want to raise my children? And so I think that plays a factor as well. So what we have found is, and the literature has suggested, that the more you're able to find individuals who have similar backgrounds, the more likely they are to stick with it, because they have a greater understanding of what it means to practice in rural and underserved areas. And so it's very different for those who have that background than for those who don't. So as an example, we have students who may come from, urban New York, and we support, for example, Montefiore in their training of students there. I think it would be a difficult task to take a student from there and put them in rural Kansas and expect them to provide services there for the next 20, 25 years. I think that's very challenging. But you identify those same students, similar students in Kansas, in rural Kansas, for example, within that state, and encourage them and support them to stay in those states. I think that first question about Arizona, I was really serious. If you're from Arizona, stay in Arizona. You're more likely to be successful, impactful, than to go off to New York and then try to come back to Arizona. So we think training in place, community-based training, is one of the mitigating ways, or mitigates some of these factors that have students that didn't have as good a fit initially stay in those areas.
I have a question here from Adam. Dr. Padilla, what are your thoughts on the role of the physician in political advocacy for underserved communities, both in and outside of the clinic?
Well, I think you're going to play different roles in and out of the clinic, but I think what's important for all of us to recognize, I think you all recognize that, because of our privilege in society, is, let's just talk about physicians, it's a very privileged cohort, right? You're wealthier than most Americans, you're more educated than a lot of Americans. And that, I think, comes with it a certain level of responsibility in terms of being a community leader. Whether you choose to exercise that, I mean, that's up to us individually, but I think inherently your position in society puts you at a very different place than most other people. And so I think it's incumbent upon us to leverage that opportunity wherever we can and balance that both in our personal and professional lives. And certainly if you're working in a community-based organization, for example, in FQHC, I would encourage you to get involved as much as you can. I go back to what I said earlier. What I gained from living in the community was a greater understanding of, and more in-depth understanding of what my community is facing, even now. That helped me work with others to say, let's get a farmer's market started. let's reach out to some of these low-income housing, which this neighborhood has a lot of, and let's spread some of the education and health education to where individuals are living rather than expecting them to come to the clinic all the time, where we just simply can't accommodate that. I don't think I would have had that in-depth understanding if I didn't live in that community and understand some of their needs, and also understand the local politics and a political environment that you're in here in DC, or I would imagine each of you are in. So I would really encourage all of you, if you're in that position, no matter where you are in your organizations, to look for those advocacy roles and activities in your professional, which I think are going to bleed over into your personal or vice versa. I'm not sure that we clearly have a demarcation between personal life and professional life. I don't just flip a switch going to work and say, I'm no longer mission minded, or I'm not. I don't think, I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, but I don't think we operate that way. I think what you're doing in your personal life bleeds over to your professional and vice versa. So some thoughts on that.
Okay, I have a question here from Tessa. You mentioned that you were one of 2 Latinos in your class. What did you feel your MED program did well to support you, if they did? And what, in your opinion, can we as educators do to assure that we are best supporting our diverse students' needs?
Well, I'll be honest, I don't think Wake Forest supported me in the way that they could have. I don't think they understood, and I think they're getting a better grasp now, as I understand it, that they needed to support students in these particular ways. And I think it's hard for organizations that just don't have a large number of them to really focus in on that. I mean, we're talking about 2 individuals in one class. I think there were 6 in the entire medical school by my count. So I think it makes it tough for them. So I don't think that they did what they could have done at the time. And my discussions with them, you know, and any dean that I'm at is like, what are you doing now? What can you do now to support them? And I would go back to these social determinants of education. And I don't think that this is the case for ATSU, but what is the institution doing to recognize those social determinants of education and those factors that are impeding their students' ability to matriculate and graduate from your programs? Are you intentionally looking at that and saying, what else can we do to support them? Because if you apply just a standard for all of them, then you may be missing opportunities to support really talented future providers. And you've missed that opportunity because those struggles weren't addressed that maybe would have helped them ultimately graduate and support these communities. So I think that asking your administrators a tough question. You know, here are these social determinants of education, right? Whether it's housing or my family's financials, these things are influencing your students now. And is the school being intentional about finding out what they are and supporting and addressing and supporting those?
Thank you. I have a question here from Hong. Dr. Padilla, thank you very much for mentioning AHECs to support and grow healthcare workforce development. In Missouri, AHEC program office resides in A.T. Still University College of Osteopathic Medicine. We have seven regional AHECs centers across the states. So it's just a comment. Do you have anything to say on that behalf?
Well, I would just say that, you know, kudos to Missouri. Not only do they have an AHEC, they also have a medical student education grant of ours. And that is a grant that supports medical schools that have tribal linkages, that have primary care shortages to support those medical students completing their education. So Missouri was awarded that grant along with their AHEC. And when I spoke to them at a conference last year, they were just delighted to have both because they see the linkages. Now that we have this HRSA grant for medical students, now we have AHEC. How do we link the two? How do we, you know, again, strengthen that continuum that Missouri is facing just like any other state? So kudos to Missouri for getting that award as well.
Thank you. I have a question here from Monica. As a medical student that is committed to working in underserved primary care, what skills or experiences should I prioritize now that I am well prepared for my future in this work?
Well, if you haven't gotten, and it's called different terms, but primary care, in my perspective, is a lot of relationship building, a lot of relationship strengthening, and keeping those relationships that are really going to be the basis of strong communication with you and the patients and families that you serve. And so if you don't feel you have a good foundation for those skills, some people have described it as motivational interviewing, but taking a look at that and getting any additional support or skills building in that area could really go a long way. As I said, primary care is about relationship building, about negotiating, about meeting patients where they are and communities where they are. And I found myself getting into some trouble when I tried to impose rather than listening and partnering and facilitating and supporting change, which is what we do in health, right? We're trying to support change, right? You're not quite there here. We want you to be over here. That's change on your part. And how can I help you facilitate that change? So change management. If you think you have a good grasp, that's great. But change management comes into play all the time, both personally and professionally for me. Both individually, I've got to exercise better. I've got to exercise more. That's change management. I've got to implement a strategic plan for the organization. How do I get buy-in for that? That's change management. And I don't think we realize how much change management skills we don't have until we're thrust in a situation where you have to manage change. So I would say that that's another part where if I had to do it again, I would get a lot more intensive training earlier on about how to manage change.
Thank you. I have a question here from Dr. Kim Perry. She said, thank you for your comments, Dr. Padilla. I'm an African-American dentist, and when I was in dental school at UNC, I experienced many of the challenges that you shared. Isolation makes an already challenging environment difficult.
Yeah, and kudos to you for going into that profession. Diversity in medical education's not where we want it to be, and in oral health, it's even worse. So kudos to you for getting into dentistry school and continuing your path.
Question here from Dr. Christine Morgan. We have limited AHEC support in Arizona. They primarily support the state-funded schools. Any suggestions on how we can address this?
I think all of our, we certainly hear this from all of our AHEC partners. The level of funding, it's higher than it's been in years, not obviously high enough to meet all the needs. And I think what all of them have done and continue to do well is form those partnerships that will leverage their resources. I think this is what AHECs do really well throughout the country in their AHEC centers. They understand there's limited resources, and they really do a tremendous job of leveraging their partnerships, both regionally, state, and even nationally, to support their efforts. So I think Arizona is going to no different. I think they've got a good team there that are going to leverage their PCAs, their PCOs, their academic institutions, their community-based organizations. There are a lot of partners in Arizona that really would aid them in what appears to us to be really similar missions and aims for the state.
Thank you. At this point, I don't have any further questions. I think this would be good. I know you have a 2 o'clock meeting here shortly, so it'd be a good stopping point. Dr. Cloud, do you have any comments?
Yes, let me close by saying that the ATSU is honored to know you, Dr. Padilla. Thank you so much for sharing with us. And the nation, and especially the nation's underserved communities, national safety net of health centers, are really blessed by the demand of such compassion and humble compassion, as a matter of fact, is going to bat for them. So thank you for what you do. Thanks for coming to inspire us today to make a difference in this world.
Well,
thank you, guys.
Gary. Thank you all. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Padilla.
Thank you, everybody. We'll be looking forward to the next George BlueSpruce Hero Healer Luncheon series. Thank you, guys.
Thank you all. Be well, be safe. Thank you so much. Thank you.